Begging your pardon, Mr. Frodo,
he said.
Have you any notion of how far there is still to go?
No. Not any clear notion, Sam. Frodo answered.
In Rivendell, before I set out, I was shown a map of Mordor that was made before the enemy came back here, but I only remember it vaguely. I remember clearest that there was a place in the north where the Western Range and the Northern Range set out spurs that nearly meet. That must be 20 leagues at least from the bridge back by the tower. It might be a good point at which to cross. But of course, if we get there, we shall be further than we were from the mountain. 60 miles from it, I should think. I guess that we have gone about 12 leagues north from the bridge now. Even if all goes well, I should hardly reach the mountain in a week. I'm afraid, Sam, that the burden will get very heavy. And I shall go still slower as we get nearer.
Sam sighed.
That is just as I feared,
he said.
Well, to say nothing of water, we've got to eat less, Mr. Frodo, or else move a bit quicker at any rate while we're still in this valley. One more bite and all the food's ended, save the elves' waybread. I'll try and be a bit quicker, Sam,
said Frodo, drawing a deep breath.
Come on then. Let's start another march.
It was not yet quite dark again. They plodded along out into the night. The hours passed in a weary stumbling trudge and with a few brief halts. At first hint of grey light under the skins of the canopy of shadow, they hid themselves again in a dark hollow under an overhanging stone. Slowly the light grew until it was clearer than it yet had been. A strong wind from the west was now driving the fumes of Mordor from the upper airs. Before long, the hobbits could make out the shape of the land for some miles about them. The trough between the mountains and the Morgai had steadily dwindled as it climbed upwards, and the inner ridge was now no more than a shelf in the steep faces of the Efelduath. But to the east it fell, as sheerly as ever, down to Gorgoroth. Ahead the watercourse came to an end in broken steps of rock, for out of the main range there sprang a high barren spur, thrusting eastward like a wall. To meet it there, stretched out from the grey and misty northern range, the Ered Lithwi, a long jutting arm, and between the ends there was a narrow gap. Carach Angren, the Eisenmouth beyond which lay the deep dale of Udun. In that dale behind the Morannon there were tunnels and deep armories that the servants of Mordor had made for the defence of the Black Gate of their land. And there now their lord was gathering in haste great forces to meet the onslaught of the captains of the west. Upon the outthrust spurs, forts and towers were built, and watchfires burned, and all across the gap an earth wall had been raised, and a deep trench delved that could be crossed only by a single bridge. A few miles north, high up in the angle where the western spur branched away from the main range, stood the old castle of Durthang, now one of the many orc holds that clustered about the Dale of Udun. A road already visible in the glowing night came winding down from it, until only a mile or two from where the hobbits lay, it turned east and ran along a shelf cut in the side of the spur, and so went down into the plain, and on to the Eisenmouth. To the hobbits as they looked out, it seemed that all their journey north had been useless. The plain on their right was dim and smoky, and they could see there neither camps nor troops moving. But all that region was under the vigilance of the forts of Carach Angren.
We have come to a dead end, Sam,
said Frodo.
If we go on, we shall only come up to that orc tower. And the only road to take is that road that comes down from it, unless we go back. We can't climb up westward or climb down eastward. Then we must take the road, Mr. Frodo,
said Sam.
We must take it and chance our luck if there is any luck in Mordor. We might as well give ourselves up as wander about anymore, or try to go back. Our food won't last. We've got to make a dash for it. All right, Sam,
said Frodo.
Lead me. As long as you've got any hope left. Mine is gone. But I can't dash, Sam. I'll just plod along after you. Before you start any more plodding, you need sleep and food, Mr. Frodo. Come and take what you can get of him.
He gave Frodo water and an additional wafer of the way bread, and he made a pillow of his cloak for his master's head. Frodo was too weary to debate the matter, and Sam did not tell him that he had drunk the last drop of their water, and eaten Sam's share of the food as well as his own. When Frodo was asleep, Sam bent over him and listened to his breathing, and scanned his face. It was lined and thin, and yet in sleep it looked content and unafraid.
Well, here goes, Master.
Sam muttered to himself.
I'll have to leave you for a bit and trust to luck. Water we must have or we'll get no further.
Sam crept out, and flitting from stone to stone with more than hobbit care, he went down into the watercourse, and then followed it for some way as it climbed north, until he came to the rock steps where long ago, no doubt, its spring had come gushing down in a little waterfall. All now seemed dry and silent, but refusing to despair, Sam stooped and listened, and to his delight he caught the sound of trickling. Clambering a few steps up, he found a tiny stream of dark water that came out from the hillside, and filled a little bare pool, from which again it spilled, and vanished then under the barren stones. Sam tasted the water, and it seemed good enough. Then he drank deeply, refilled the bottle, and turned to go back. At that moment he caught a glimpse of a black form or shadow flitting across the rocks away near Frodo's hiding place. Biting back a cry, he leapt down from the spring and ran, jumping from stone to stone. It was a wary creature, difficult to see, but Sam had little doubt about it. He longed to get his hands on its neck, but it heard him coming and slipped quickly away. Sam thought he saw a last fleeting glimpse of it, peering back over the edge of the eastward precipice before it ducked and disappeared.
Well, luck did not let me down.
Muttered Sam.
That was a near thing, if it isn't enough. I've walked by 1,000 without that stinking villain coming nosing around. I wish he'd been shot.
He sat down by Frodo and did not rouse him, but he did not dare to go to sleep himself. At last, when he felt his eyes closing, and knew that his struggle to keep awake would not go on much longer, he wakened Frodo gently.
Gollum's about again, I'm afraid, Mr. Frodo,
he said.
Leastways, if it wasn't him, then there's two of him. I went away to find some water. He's biding nosing round just as I turned back. I reckon it isn't safe for us both to sleep together. And begging your pardon, but I can't hold up my lids much longer. Bless you, Sam,
said Frodo.
Lie down and take your proper turn. But I'd rather have Gollum than orcs. At any rate, he won't give us away to them, not unless he's called himself. But he might do a bit of robbery and murder on his own,
growled Sam.
Keep your eyes open, Mr. Frodo. There's a bottle full of water. Drink up. We can fill it again when we go on.
With that, Sam plunged into sleep. Light was fading when he awoke. Frodo sat propped against the rock behind, but he had fallen asleep. The water bottle was empty. There was no sign of Gollum. Mordor dark had returned, and the watchfires of the heights burned fierce and red when the hobbits set out again on the most dangerous stage of all their journey. They went first to the little spring, and then climbing wearily up, they came to the road at the point where it swung east towards the Ironmouth, 20 miles away. It was not a broad road, and it had no wall or parapet along the edge, and as it ran on, the sheer drop of its brink became deeper and deeper. The hobbits could hear no movements, and after listening for a while, they set off eastward at a steady pace. After doing some 12 miles, they halted. A short way back, the road had bent a little northward, and the stretch that they had passed over was now screened from sight. This proved disastrous. They rested for some minutes, and then went on. But they had not taken many steps when suddenly, in the stillness of the night, they heard the sound that all along that they had secretly dreaded. The noise of marching feet. It was still some way behind them, but looking back they could see the twinkle of torches coming round the bend less than a mile away. And they were moving fast. Too fast for Frodo to escape by flight along the road ahead.
I feared it, Sam,
said Frodo.
We've trusted to luck. It has failed us. We're trapped.
He looked wildly up at the frowning wall, where the road builders of old had cut the rock sheer for many fathoms above their heads. He ran to the other side and looked over the brink into a dark pit of gloom.
We're trapped at last,
he said. He sank to the ground beneath the wall of rock and bowed his head.
Seems so,
said Sam.
Well, we can but wait and see.
And with that, he sat down beside Frodo under the shadow of the cliff. They did not have to wait long. The orcs were going at a great pace. Those in the foremost files bore torches. On they came, red flames in the dark, swiftly growing. Now Sam too bowed his head, hoping that it would hide his face when the torches reached them, and he set their shields before their knees to hide their feet.
If only they are in a hurry, we'll let a couple of tired soldiers alone and pass on,
he thought. And so it seemed that they would. The leading orcs came loping along, panting, holding their heads down. They were a gang of the smaller breeds, being driven unwilling to their Dark Lord's wars. All they cared for was to get the march over and escape the whip. Beside them, running up and down the line, went two of the large, fierce Uruks, cracking lashes and shouting. File after file passed, and the telltale torchlight was already somewhere ahead. Sam held his breath. More than half the line had gone by. Then suddenly one of the slave drivers spied the two figures by the roadside. He flicked the whip at them and yelled. They did not answer, and with a shout he halted the whole company.
Come on, you slugs! This is no time for spouting!
He took a step towards them, and even in the gloom he recognized the devices on their shields.
Deserting, eh?
He snarled.
Or thinking of it? All your folks should have been inside the dirt before yesterday evening, you know that. Up you get, and fall in, or I'll have your numbers and report you.
They struggled to their feet, and keeping bent, limping like footsore soldiers, they shuffled back towards the rear of the line.
No, not all at the rear!
The slave driver shouted.
3 miles up and stay there, or you'll know it when I come down the line!
He sent his long whiplash cracking over their heads, and with another crack and a yell he started the company off again at a brisk trot. It was hard enough for poor Sam, tired as he was, but for Frodo it was a torment, and soon a nightmare. He set his teeth and tried to stop his mind from thinking, and he struggled on. The stench of the sweating orcs about him was stifling, and he began to gasp with thirst. On they went, and he bent all his will to draw his breath and to make his legs keep going, and yet to what evil end he toiled and endured he did not dare to think. There was no hope of falling out unseen. Now and again the orc driver fell back and jeered at them.
There now!
He laughed, flicking at their legs.
Here, there's a whip! There's a will! My slugs! Hold up! I'll give you a nice pressure now, only you'll get as much mass as your skin will carry when you come in late to your camp. So you good? You know we're at war!
They had gone some miles, and the road was at last running down a long slope into the plain when Frodo's strength began to give out, and his will wavered. He lurched and stumbled. Desperately Sam tried to help him and hold him up, though he felt that he could himself hardly stay the pace much longer. At any moment now he knew that the end would come. His master would faint or fall, and all would be discovered, and their bitter efforts be in vain.
I'll have that big slave-driving devil anyway,
he thought. Then, just as he was putting his hand to the hilt of his sword, there came an unexpected relief. They were out on the plain now and drawing near the entrance to a dune. Some way in front of it, before the gate at the bridge end, the road from the west converged with others coming from the south and from Barad-dûr. Along all the roads, troops were moving, and the captains of the west were advancing, and the Dark Lord was speeding his forces north. So it chanced that several companies came together at the road meeting, in the dark beyond the light of the watchfires of the wall. At once there was great jostling and cursing as each group tried to get first to the gate and the ending of their march, though the drivers yelled and plied their whips. Scuffles broke out, and some blades were drawn. A troop of heavy-armed Uruks from Barad-dûr charged into the Durthang line and threw them into confusion. Dazed as he was with pain and weariness, Sam woke up, grasped quickly at his chance, and threw himself to the ground, dragging Frodo down with him. Orcs fell over him, snarling and cursing. Slowly on hand and knee, the hobbits crawled away out of the turmoil until at last, unnoticed, they dropped over the further edge of the road. It had a high curve by which troop leaders could guide themselves in black night or fog, and it was banked up some feet above the level of the open land. They lay still for a while. It was too dark to seek for cover, if indeed there was any to find. But Sam felt that they ought at least to get further away from the highways and out of the range of torchlight.
Come on, Mr. Frodo.
He whispered.
One more crawl, and then you can lie still.
With a last despairing effort, Frodo raised himself on his hands and struggled on for maybe 20 yards. Then he pitched down into a shallow pit that opened unexpectedly before them, and there he lay, like a dead thing. Sam put his ragged orc cloak under his master's head and covered them both with the grey robe of Lorien. And as he did so, his thoughts went out to that far land, and to the elves, and he hoped that the cloth woven by their hands might have some virtue to keep them hidden beyond all hope in this wilderness of fear. He heard the scuffling and cries die down as the troops passed on through the Eisenmouth. It seemed that in the confusion and the mingling of many companies of various kinds, they had not been missed. Not yet, at any rate. Sam took a sip of water, but pressed Frodo to drink, and when his master had recovered a little, he gave him a whole wafer of their precious whey bread, and made him eat it. Then, too worn out even to feel much fear, they stretched themselves out. They slept a little in uneasy fits, for their sweat grew chill on them, and the hard stones bit them, and they shivered. Out of the north from the black gate through Cirith Gorgor there flowed whispering along the ground a thin, cold air. In the morning a grey light came again, for in the high regions the west wind still blew, but down on the stones behind the fences of the Black Clan the air seemed almost dead, chill and yet stifling. Sam looked up out of the hollow. The land all about was dreary, flat and drab-hued. On the roads nearby, nothing was moving now, but Sam feared the watchful eyes on the wall of the Eisenmouth, no more than a furlong away northward. Southeastward and far off like a dark standing shadow loomed the mountain. Smokes were pouring from it, and while those that rose into the upper air trailed away eastward, great rolling clouds floated down its sides and spread over the land. A few miles to the northeast, the foothills of the Ashen Mountains stood, like somber grey ghosts, behind which the misty northern heights like a line of distant cloud hardly darker than the lowering sky. Sam tried to guess the distance and to decide what way they ought to take.
It looks every step to 50 miles,
he muttered gloomily, staring at the threatening mountain.
and that'll take a week if it takes a day.
He shook his head, and as he worked things out, slowly a new dark thought grew in his mind. Never for long had hope died in his staunch heart, and always until now he had taken some thought of their return. But the bitter truth came home to him at last. At best, their provision would take them to their goal, and when the task was done, there they would come to an end. Alone, houseless, foodless in the midst of a terrible desert. There could be no return.
So that was the job I felt I had to do when I started.
Thought Sam.
To help Mr. Frodo to the last step, and die with him. Well, if that's the job, then I must do it. But I would dearly like to see Bywater again. And Rosie Cotton, and our brothers, and the Gaffer and Marigold and all. I can't think somehow that Gandalf would have sent Mr. Frodo on this errand if there hadn't been any hope of his ever coming back at all. Things all went wrong when he went down in Moria. I wish he hadn't. He would have done something.
But even as hope died in Sam, or seemed to die, it was turned to a new strength. Sam's plain hobbit face grew stern, almost grim, as the will hardened in him, and he felt through all his limbs a thrill, as if he was turning into some creature of stone and steel that neither despair nor weariness nor endless barren miles could subdue. With a new sense of responsibility, he brought his eyes back to the ground, near at hand, studying the next move. As the light grew, a little he saw to his surprise that what from a distance had seemed wide and featureless, flats were in fact all broken and tumbled. Indeed, the whole surface of the plains of Gorgoroth was pocked with great holes, as if, while it was still a waste of soft mud, it had been smitten with a shower of bolts and huge sling stones. The largest of these holes were rimmed with edges of broken rock, and broad fissures ran out from them in all directions. It was a land in which it would be possible to creep from hiding to hiding, unseen by all but the most watchful eyes. Possible at least for one who was strong, and had no need for speed. For the hungry and worn, who had far to go before life failed, it had an evil look. Thinking of all these things, Sam went back to his master. He had to rouse him. Frodo was lying on his back with eyes open, staring at the cloudy sky.
Well, Mr. Frodo,
Said Sam.
I've been having a look around and thinking a bit. There's nothing on the roads, and we'd best be getting away while there's a chance. Can you manage it? I can manage it,
Said Frodo.
I must.
Once they started crawling from hollow to hollow, flitting behind such cover as they could find, but moving always in a slant towards the foothills of the northern range. But as they went, the most easterly of the roads followed them, until it ran off, hugging the skirts of the mountains, away into a wall of black shadow far ahead. Neither man nor orc now moved along its flat grey stretches, for the Dark Lord had almost completed the movement of his forces, and even in the fastness of his own realm he sought the secrecy of night, fearing the winds of the world that had turned against him, tearing aside his veils and troubled with the tidings of bold spies that had passed through his fences. The hobbits had gone a few weary miles when they halted. Frodo seemed nearly spent. Sam saw that he could not go much further in his fashion, crawling, stooping, now picking a doubtful way very slowly, now hurrying at a stumbling run.
I'm going back to the road while the light lasts, Mr. Frodo,
He said.
Trust to luck again. It nearly failed us last time. But it didn't quite. A steady pace for a few more miles, and then a rest.
He was taking a far greater risk than he knew. But Frodo was too much occupied with his burden and with the struggle in his mind to debate, and almost too hopeless to care. They climbed on to the causeway and trudged along, down the hard, cruel road that led to the Dark Tower itself. But their luck held, and for the rest of that day they met no living or moving thing. And when night fell, they vanished into the darkness of Mordor, and the land now brooded as the coming of a great storm. For the captains of the west had passed the crossroads and set flames in the deadly fields of Imlad Morgul. So the desperate journey went on, as the ring went south and the banners of the kings rode north. For the hobbits each day, each mile, was more bitter than the one before, as their strength lessened and the land became more evil. They met no enemies by day. At times by night, as they cowered or drowsed uneasily in some hiding beside the road, they heard cries and the noise of many feet, or the swift passing of some cruelly hidden steed. But far worse than all such perils was the ever-approaching threat that beat upon them as they went. the dreadful menace of the power that waited, brooding in deep thought and sleepless malice behind the dark veil about its throne. Nearer and nearer it drew, looming blacker, like the oncoming of a wall of night at the last end of the world. There came at last a dreadful nightfall, and even as the captains of the West drew near to the end of the living lands, the two wanderers came to an hour of blank despair. 4 days had passed since they had escaped from the orcs, but the time lay behind them like an ever-darkening dream. All this last day Frodo had not spoken, but had walked half-bowed, often stumbling, as if his eyes no longer saw the way before his feet. Sam guessed that among all their pains he bore the worst, the growing weight of the ring, a burden on the body and a torment to his mind. Anxiously, Sam had noted how his master's left hand would often be raised as if to ward on a blow, or to screen his shrinking eyes from a dreadful eye that sought to look in them. And sometimes his right hand would creep to his breast, clutching, and then slowly, as the will recovered mastery, it would be withdrawn. Now, as the blackness of night returned, Frodo sat, his head between his knees, his arms hanging wearily to the ground where his hands lay feebly twitching. Sam watched him, till night covered them both and hid them from one another. He could no longer find any words to say, and he turned to his own dark thoughts. As for himself, though weary and under a shadow of fear, he still had some strength left. The Lembas had a virtue without which they would long ago have lain down to die. It did not satisfy desire, and at times Sam's mind was filled with the memories of food and the longing for simple bread and meats. And yet this waybread of the elves had a potency that increased as travelers relied on it alone and did not mingle it with other foods. It fed the will, and it gave strength to endure, and to master sinew and limb beyond the measure of mortal kind. But now a new decision must be made. They could not follow this road any longer, for it went on eastward into the great shadow. But the mountain now loomed upon their right, almost due south, and they must turn towards it. Yet still before it there stretched a wide region of fuming, barren, ash-ridden land. Water, muttered Sam. He had stinted himself, and in his parched mouth his tongue seemed thick and swollen. But for all his care, they now had very little left. Perhaps half his bottle, and maybe there were still days to go. All would long ago have been spent, but they had not dared to follow the Orc road, for at long intervals on that highway, cisterns had been built for the use of troops, sent in haste through the waterless regions. In one, Sam had found some water left, stale, muddied by the orcs, but still sufficient for their desperate case. Yet it was now a day ago. There was no hope of any more. At last, wearied with his cares, Sam drowsed, leaving the morrow till it came. He could do no more. Dream and waking mingled uneasily. He saw lights like gloating eyes, and dark creeping shapes, and he heard noises as of wild beasts or the dreadful cries of tortured things. And he would start up to find the world all dark, and only empty blackness all about him. Once only, as he stood and stared wildly round, did it seem that, though now awake, he could still see pale lights like eyes, but soon they flickered and vanished. The hateful night passed slowly and reluctantly. Such daylight as followed was dim. But here, as the mountain drew nearer, the air was ever murky, while out of the dark tower there crept the veils of shadow that Sauron wove about himself. Frodo was lying on his back, not moving. Sam stood beside him, reluctant to speak, and yet knowing that the word now lay with him. He must set his master's will to do work for another effort. At length, stooping and caressing Frodo's brow, he spoke in his ear.
"Wake up, master,"
he said.
"Time for another start."
As if roused by a sudden bell, Frodo rose quickly and stood up and looked away southwards. But when his eyes beheld the mountain and the desert, he quailed again.
I can't manage it, Sam,
He said.
It's such a weight to carry. Such a weight.
Sam knew before he spoke that it was vain, and that such words might do more harm than good. But in his pity, he could not keep silent.
Then let me carry it a bit for you, Master.
He said.
You know I would. And gladly. As long as I have any strength.
A wild light came into Frodo's eyes.
Stay away! Don't
He
speak!
cried.
It is mine, I say! Be off!
His hand stayed to his sword hilt, then quickly his voice changed.
No, Sam.
He said sadly.
But you must understand. It is my burden, and no one else can bear it. It is too late now. Sam, dear. You can't help me in the way again. I'm almost in its power now. I should not give up. And if you try to take it, I should combat.
Sam nodded.
I understand, he said. But I've been thinking, Mr. Frodo. There's other things that we might have to do without. Why not lighten the load a bit? We might bring that way now, as straight as we can make it.
He pointed to the mountain.
It's no good taking anything we're not sure to need.
Frodo looked again towards the mountain.
No, he said, we shan't need much on that road. And at its ending, nothing.
Picking up his orc shield, he flung it away and threw his helmet after it. Then pulling off the grey cloak, he undid the heavy belt and let it fall to the ground, and the sheathed sword with it. The shreds of that black cloak he tore off and scattered.
I'll be an orc no more,
He cried.
and I'll bear no weapon, fair or foul. Let them take it if they will.
Sam did likewise, and put aside his orc gear, and he took out all the things in his pack. Somehow each of them had become dear to him, if only because he had borne them so far with so much toil. Hardest of all it was to part with his cooking gear. Tears welled in his eyes at the thought of casting it away.
Do you remember that bit of rabbit, Mr. Frodo?
He said.
In our place under the warm bank in Captain Farmer's country. I'm afraid not, Sam.
Said Frodo.
At least, I know that such things happened, but I cannot see them. No taste of food, no feel of water, no sound of wind, no memory of tree or grass or flower. No image of moon or star are left to me. I am naked in the dark, Sam. There is no veil between me and the wheel of fire. I begin to see it, even in my waking eyes. And all else fails.
Sam went to him and kissed his hand.
The sooner we're rid of it, the sooner to rest.
He said haltingly, finding no better words to say.
Talking won't mend nothing.
He muttered to himself, as he gathered up all the things that they had chosen to cast away. He was not willing to leave them lying open in the wilderness for any eyes to see.
Stinker picked up that orc shirt, seemingly. And he isn't going to add a sword to it. His hands are bad enough when empty. And he isn't going to mess with my pans.
With that, he carried all the gear away to one of the many gaping fissures that scored the land and threw them in. The clatter of his precious pans as they fell down into the dark was like a death knell to his heart. He came back to Frodo, and then of his elven rope he cut a short piece to serve his master as a girdle and bind the grey cloak close about his waist. The rest he carefully coiled and put back in his pack. Beside that he kept only the remnants of their waybread and the water bottle, and Sting still hanging by his belt and hidden away in a pocket of his tunic next his breast the phial of Galadriel and the little box that she gave him for his own. Now at last they turned their faces to the mountain and set out, thinking no more of concealment, bending their weariness and failing wills only to the one task of going on. In the dimness of its dreary day, few things even in that land of vigilance could have espied them, save from close at hand. Of all the slaves of the Dark Lord, only the Nazgul could have warned him of the peril that crept, small but indomitable, into the very heart of his guarded realm. But the Nazgul and their black wings were abroad on other errand. They were gathered far away, shadowing the march of the captains of the West, and thither the thought of the Dark Lord was turned. That day it seemed to Sam that his master had found some new strength, more than could be explained by the small lightening of the load that he had to carry. In the first marches they went further and faster than he had hoped. Their land was rough and hostile, and yet they made much progress, and ever the mountain drew nearer. But as the day wore on, and all too soon the dim light began to fail, Frodo stooped again and began to stagger, as if the renewed effort had squandered his remaining strength. At their last halt, he sank down and said,
I'm thirsty, Sam.
and did not speak again. Sam gave him a mouthful of water. Only one more mouthful remained. He went without himself, and now as once more the night of Mordor closed over them. Through all his thoughts there came the memory of water, and every brook or stream or fount that he had ever seen under the green willow shades of twinkling in the sun danced and rippled for his torment behind the blindness of his eyes. He felt the cool mud about his toes as he paddled in the pool at Bywater, with Jolly Cotton and Tom and Nibs, and their sister Rosie.
But that was 10 years ago.
He sighed.
And far away. The way back, if there is one, goes past the mountain.
He could not sleep and held a debate with himself.
Oh, come now. We've done better than you hoped.
He said sturdily.
Began well anyway. I reckoned crossed half of the distance before we stopped. One more day will do it.
And then he paused.
Don't be a fool, Sam Gamgee.
Came an answer to his own voice.
He won't go another day like that if he moves at all. And you can't go on much longer giving him all the water and most of the food. I can go on a good way through. And I will. Where to? To the mountain, of course. But what then, Sam Gamgee? What then? When you get there, what are you going to do? He won't be able to do anything for himself.
To his dismay, Sam realized that he had not got an answer to this. He had no clear idea at all. Frodo had not spoken much to him of his errand, and Sam only knew vaguely that the ring had somehow to be put into the fire.
The cracks of doom,
he muttered, the old name rising to his mind.
Well, if Master knows how to find them, I don't. There you are,
came the answer.
It's all quite useless,
he said to himself.
You are the fool going and hoping and toiling. You could have lain down and gone to sleep together days ago if you hadn't been so dogged. But you died just the same or worse. You might just as well lie down and give up. You'll never get to the top anyway. I'll get there if I leave everything but my bones behind,
said Sam.
And I'll carry Mr. Frodo up myself if it breaks my back and heart. So stop arguing!
At that moment, Sam felt a tremor in the ground beneath him, and he heard or sensed a deep remote rumble as of thunder imprisoned under the earth. There was a brief red flame that flicked under the clouds and died away. The mountain too slept uneasily. The last stage of their journey to Orodruin came, and it was a torment greater than Sam had ever thought that he could bear. He was in pain, and so parched that he could no longer swallow even a mouthful of food. It remained dark, not only because of the smokes of the mountain. There seemed to be a storm coming up, and away to the southeast there was a shimmer of lightnings under the black skies. Worst of all, the air was full of fumes. Breathing was painful and difficult, and a dizziness came on them so that they staggered and often fell. And yet their wills did not yield, and they struggled on. The mountain crept up ever nearer, until, if they lifted their heavy heads, it filled all their sight, looming vast before them, a huge mass of ash and slag and burned stone, out of which a sheer-sided cone was raised into the clouds. Before the day-long dusk ended and true night came again, they had crawled and stumbled to its very feet. With a gasp, Frodo cast himself on the ground. Sam sat by him, To his surprise, he felt tired but lighter, and his head seemed clear again. No more debates disturbed his mind. He knew all the arguments of despair and would not listen to them. His will was set, and only death would break it. He felt no longer either desire or need of sleep, but rather of watchfulness. He knew that all the hazards and perils were now drawing together to a point. The next day would be a day of doom, the day of final effort or disaster. The last gasp. But when would it come? The night seemed endless and timeless, minute after minute falling dead and adding up to no passing hour, bringing no change. Sam began to wonder if a second darkness had begun and no day would ever reappear. At last he groped for Frodo's hand. It was cold and trembling. His master was shivering.
I didn't ought to have left my blanket behind,
muttered Sam. And lying down, he tried to comfort Frodo with his arms and body. Then sleep took him, and the dim light of the last day of their quest found them side by side. The wind had fallen the day before as it shifted from the west, and now it came from the north and began to rise. And slowly the light of the unseen sun filtered down into the shadows where the hobbits lay.
"Now for it! Now for the last gasp!"
said Sam as he struggled to his feet. He bent over Frodo, rousing him gently. Frodo groaned, but with a great effort of will he staggered up, and then he fell upon his knees again. He raised his eyes with difficulty to the dark slopes of Mount Doom, towering above him. And then pitifully he began to crawl forward on his hands. Sam looked at him and wept in his heart, but no tears came to his dry and stinging eyes.
"I said I'd carry him if it broke my back,
he muttered.
and I will. Come, Mr. Frodo!
He cried.
I can't carry it for you, but I can't carry you, and it as well. So up you get. Come on, Mr. Frodo, dear. Sam will give you a ride. Just tell him where to go, and he'll go.
As Frodo clung upon his back, arms loosed about his neck, legs clasped firmly under his arms, Sam staggered to his feet, and then to his amazement he felt the burden light. He had feared that he would have barely strength to lift his master alone, and beyond that he had expected to share in the dreadful dragging weight of the accursed ring. But it was not so. Whether because Frodo was so worn by his long pains, wound of knife and venomous sting, and sorrow, fear and homeless wandering, or because some gift of final strength was given to him, Sam lifted Frodo with no more difficulty than if he were carrying a hobbit child piggyback in some romp on the lawns or hayfields of the Shire. He took a deep breath and started off. They had reached the mountain's foot on its northern side, and a little to the westward, there its long grey slopes, though broken, were not sheer. Frodo did not speak, and so Sam struggled on as best he could, having no guidance but the will to climb as high as might be before his strength gave out and his will broke. On he toiled up and up, turning this way and that, to lessen the slope, often stumbling forward, and at the last crawling like a snail, with a heavy burden on his back. When his will could drive him no further, and his limbs gave way, he stopped and laid his master gently down. Frodo opened his eyes and drew a breath. It was easier to breathe up here, above the reeks that coiled and drifted down below.
Thank you, Sam.
He said in a cracked whisper.
How far is there to go? Oh, I don't know,
Said Sam.
because I don't know where we're going.
He looked back, and then he looked up, and he was amazed to see how far his last effort had brought him. The mountain, standing ominous and alone, had looked taller than it was. Sam saw now that it was less lofty than the high passes of the Ethel Duath, which he and Frodo had scaled. The confused and tumbled shoulders of its great base rose for maybe 3,000 feet above the plain, and above them, reared half as high, again its tall central cone, like a vast oast or chimney capped with a jagged crater. But already Sam was more than halfway up the base, and the plain of Golgoroth was dim below him, wrapped in fume and shadow. As he looked up, he would have given a shout if his parched throat had allowed him, for amid the rugged humps and shoulders above him he saw plainly a path or road. It climbed like a rising girdle from the west and wound snake-like about the mountain, until before it went round out of view it reached the foot of the cone upon its eastern side. Sam could not see the course immediately above him, where it was lowest, for a steep slope went up where he stood, but he guessed that if he could only struggle on just a little way further up, they could strike this path. A gleam of hope returned to him. They might conquer the mountain yet.
Why, it might have been put there a purpose.
He said to himself.
If it wasn't there, I'd have to say it was beaten in the end.
The path was not put there for the purposes of Sam. He did not know it, but he was looking at Sauron's road, from the Barad-dûr to the Samathnaur, the Chambers of Fire. Out of the dark tower's huge western gate it came over a deep abyss by a vast bridge of iron, and then passing into the plain it ran for a league between two smoking chasms, and so reached a long sloping causeway that led up on to the mountain's eastern side. Thence, turning up and circling all its wide girth from south to north, it climbed at last, high in the upper cone, but still far from the reeking summit, to a dark entrance that gazed back east straight to the window of the eye in Sauron's shadow-mantled fortress. Often blocked or destroyed by the tumults of the mountain's furnaces, always that road was repaired and cleaned again by the labours of countless orcs. Sam drew a deep breath. There was a path, but how he was to get up the slopes to it he did not know. First he must ease his aching back. He lay flat beside Frodo for a while. Neither spoke. Slowly the light grew. Suddenly a sense of urgency which he did not understand came to Sam. It was almost as if he had been called.
Now, or it will be too late!
He braced himself and got up. Frodo also seemed to have felt the call. He struggled to his knees.
I'll crawl, Sam.
He gasped. So, foot by foot, like small grey insects, they crept up the slope. They came to the path and found that it was broad, paved with broken rubble and beaten ash. Frodo clambered onto it, and then moved as if by some compulsion he turned slowly to face the east. Far off the shadows of Sauron hung. But torn by some gust of wind out of the world, or else moved by some great disquiet within, the mantling clouds swirled, and for a moment drew aside, and he saw, rising blacker and darker than the vast shades amid which it stood, the cruel pinnacles and iron crown of the topmost tower of Barad-dûr. One moment only it stared out, but as from the great window immeasurably high there stabbed northward a flame of red, the flicker of a piercing eye. And then the shadows were furled again, and the terrible vision was removed. The eye was not turned to them. It was gazing north to where the captains of the west stood at bay, and thither all this malice was now bent, as the power moved to strike its deadly blow. But Frodo at the dreadful glimpse fell as one stricken mortally. His hands sought the chain about his neck. Sam knelt by him, faint almost inaudibly. He heard Frodo whispering,
Help me, Sam. Help me, Sam. Hold my hand. I can't stop it.
Sam took his master's hands and laid them together, palm to palm, and kissed them. And then he held them gently between his own. The thought came suddenly to him.
He spotted us. It's all up. Or soon it will be. Now, Sam Gamgee. This is the end of ends.
Again he lifted Frodo and drew his hands down to his own breast, letting his master's legs dangle. Then he bowed his head and struggled off along the climbing road. It was not as easy a way to take as it had looked at first. By fortune the fires had poured forth in the great turmoils when Sam stood upon Cirith Ungol and flowed down mainly on the southern and western slopes, and the road on this side was not blocked. Yet in many places it had crumbled away or was crossed by gaping rents. After climbing eastward for some time it bent back upon itself at a sharp angle, and then went westward fox apace. There at the bend it was cut deep through a crag of old weathered stone, once long ago vomited from the mountain surfaces. Panting under his load, Sam turned the bend, and even as he did so, out of the corner of his eye, he had a glimpse of something falling from the crag, like a small piece of black stone that had toppled off as he passed. A sudden weight smote him, and he crashed forward, tearing the backs of his hands that still clasped his master's. Then he knew what had happened, for above him as he lay, he heard a hated voice.
Wicked master!
It hissed,
Wicked Master cheats us! Cheats Smeagol! He mustn't go that way! He mustn't hurt the precious! Give it to Smeagol! Yes! Give it to us! Give it to us!
With a violent heave, Sam rose up. At once he drew his sword, but he could do nothing. Gollum and Frodo were locked together. Gollum was tearing at his master, trying to get the chain and the ring. It was probably the only thing that could have roused the dying embers of Frodo's heart and will. An attack, an attempt to wrest his treasure from him by force. He fought back with a sudden fury that amazed Sam and Gollum also. Even so, things might have gone far otherwise if Gollum himself had remained unchanged. But whatever dreadful paths, lonely and hungry, and waterless, he had trodden, driven by a devouring desire and a terrible fear, they had left grievous marks on him. He was a lean, starved, haggard thing, all bones and tight-drawn, sallow skin. A wild light flaming in his eyes, but his malice was no longer matched by his old griping strength. Frodo flung him off and rose up quivering.
Down! Down!
He gasped, clutching his hand to his breast, so that beneath the cover of his leather shirt he clasped the ring.
Down, you creeping thing! And out of my path! Your time is at an end. You cannot betray me or slay me now.
Then suddenly, as before under the eaves of the Emyn Wheel, Sam saw these two rivals with other vision. A crouching shape, scarcely more than the shadow of a living thing, a creature now wholly ruined and defeated, yet filled with a hideous lust and rage, and before it stood stern, untouchable now by pity, a figure robed in white. But at its breast it held a wheel of fire. Out of the fire there spoke a commanding voice.
Begone, and trouble me no more! If you touch me ever again, you shall be cast yourself into the fire of doom!
The crouching shape backed away, terror in its blinking eyes, and yet at the same time insatiable desire. Then the vision passed and Sam saw Frodo standing, hand on his breast, his breath coming in great gasps, and Gollum at his feet, resting on his knees with his wide-splayed hands upon the ground.
Look out!
Cried Sam.
He'll spring!
He stepped forward, brandishing his sword.
Quick, Master!
He gasped.
Go on! Go on! No time to lose! I'll deal with him! Go on!
Frodo looked at him as if one now far away.
Yes, I must go on.
He said.
You will, Sam. This is the end at last. On Mount Doom, Doom shall fall.
He turned and went on, walking slowly but erect up the climbing path.
Now,
Said Sam.
at least I can deal with you!
He leapt forward with drawn blade, ready for battle. But Gollum did not spring. He fell flat upon the ground and whimpered.
Don't kill us!
He wept.
The nasty cruel still! Let us live! Yes! Live just a little longer! Lost! Lost! We're lost! And when Precious goes, we'll die! Yes! Die to the dust!
He clawed up the ashes of the path with his long, fleshless fingers.
Dust! Dust!
He hissed. Sam's hand wavered. His mind was hot with wrath and memory of evil. It would be just to slay this treacherous, murderous creature. Just and many times deserved, and also it seemed the only safe thing to do. But deep in his heart, there was something that restrained him. He could not strike this thing, lying in the dust, forlorn, ruinous, utterly wretched. He himself, though only for a little while, had borne the ring, and now dimly he guessed the agony of Gollum's shriveled mind and body. Enslaved to that ring, unable to find peace or relief ever in life again. But Sam had no words to express what he felt.
Curse you, you stinking thing!
He said,
Go away! Be off! I don't trust you, not as far as I could kick you, but be off, or I shall hurt you! Yes, with nasty, cruel steel!
Gollum got up on all fours and backed away for several paces, and then he turned, and then as Sam aimed a kick at him, he fled away down the path. Sam gave no more heed to him. He suddenly remembered his master. He looked up the path and could not see him. As fast as he could, he trudged up the road. If he had looked back, he might have seen not far below Gollum turn again, and then with a wild light of madness glaring in his eyes, come, swiftly but warily creeping on behind a slinking shadow among the stones. The path climbed on. Soon it bent again and, with a last eastward course, passed in a cutting along the fence of the cone and came back to the door in the mountainside. The door of the Sammath Nour. Far away now, rising towards the south, the sun, piercing the smokes and haze, burned ominous, a dull bleared disk of red. But old Mordor lay about the mountain like a dead land, silent, shadow-folded, waiting for some dreadful stroke. Sam came to the gaping mouth and peered in. It was dark and hot, and a deep rumbling shook the air.
Frodo! Master!
He called. There was no answer. For a moment he stood, his heart beating with wild fears, and then he plunged in. A shadow followed him. At first he could see nothing. In his great need he drew out once more the phial of Galadriel, but it was pale and cold in his trembling hand, and threw no light into that stifling dark. He was come to the heart of the realm of Sauron, and the forges of his ancient might, greatest in Middle-earth. All other powers were here subdued. Fearfully he took a few uncertain steps in the dark, and then all at once there came a flash of red that leapt upward, and smote the high black roof. Then Sam saw that he was in a long cave or tunnel that bored into the mountain's smoking cone. But only a short way ahead its floor and the walls on either side were cloven by a great fissure, out of which the red glare came, now leaping up, now dying down into darkness. And all the while, far below, there was a rumour and a trouble as of great engines throbbing and labouring. The light sprang up again, and there on the brink of the chasm, at the very crack of doom, stood Frodo. Black against the glare, tense, erect, but still, as if he had been turned to stone. Cried Sam. Then Frodo stirred, and spoke with a clear voice. Indeed, with a voice clearer and more powerful than Sam had ever heard him use. And it rose above the throb and turmoil of Mount Doom, ringing in the roof and walls.
I have come,
He said.
but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine.
And suddenly, as he set it on his finger, he vanished from Sam's sight. Sam gasped, but he had no chance to cry out, for at that moment many things happened. Something struck Sam violently in the back. His legs were knocked from under him, and he was flung aside, striking his head against the stony floor, as a dark shape sprang over him. He lay still, and for a moment all went black. And far away, as Frodo put on the ring and claimed it for his own, even in Sammath Naur, the very heart of his realm, the power of Barad-dûr was shaken, and the tower trembled from its foundations to its proud and bitter crown. The Dark Lord was suddenly aware of him, and his eye, piercing all shadows, looked across the plain into the door that he had made. And the magnitude of his own folly was revealed to him in a blinding flash, and all the devices of his enemies were at last laid bare. Then his wrath blazed in consuming flame, but his fear rose like a vast black smoke to choke him. For he knew his deadly peril and the thread upon which his doom now hung. From all his policies and webs of fear and treachery, from all his stratagems and wars, his mind shook free, and throughout his realm a tremor ran. His slaves quailed, and his armies halted, and his captains, suddenly steerless, bereft of will, wavered and despaired. For they were forgotten. The whole mind and purpose of the power that wielded them was now bent with overwhelming force upon the mountain. At this summons, wheeling with a rending cry, in a last desperate race there flew, faster than the winds, the Nazgûl, the Ring-Wraiths, and with a storm of wings they hurtled towards Mount Doom. Sam got up. He was dazed, and blood streaming from his head dripped in his eyes. He He groped forward, and then he saw a strange and terrible thing. Gollum on the edge of the abyss was fighting like a mad thing with an unseen foe. To and fro he swayed, now so near the brink that almost he tumbled in, now dragging back, falling to the ground, rising and falling again. And all the while he hissed, but spoke no words. The fires below awoke in anger, the red light blazed, and all the cavern was filled with a great glare and heat. Suddenly, Sam saw Gollum's long hands draw upwards to his mouth. His wide fangs gleamed, and then snapped as they bit. Frodo gave a cry, and there he was, fallen upon his knees at the chasm's edge. But Gollum, dancing like a mad thing, held aloft the ring. A finger still thrust within its circle. It shone now as if verily it was wrought of living fire.
Precious. 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 Precious.
Gollum cried.
Precious. My precious. Oh, my precious. My precious.
And with that, even as his eyes were lifted up to gloat on his prize, he stepped too far, toppled, wavered for a moment on the brink, and then with a shriek, he fell. Out of the depths came his last wail. And he was gone. There was a roar and a great confusion of noise. Fires leapt up and licked the roof. The throbbing grew to a great tumult, and the mountain shook. Sam ran to Frodo and picked him up and carried him out to the door, and there upon the dark threshold of the Samath Naur, high above the plains of Mordor, such wonder and terror came on him that he stood still, forgetting all else, and gazed as one turned to stone. A brief vision he had of swirling cloud, and in the midst of it towers and battlements, tall as hills, founded upon a mighty mountain throne above immeasurable pits, great courts and dungeons, eyeless prisons sheer as cliffs, and gaping gates of steel and adamant. And then, all passed. Towers fell and mountains slid, walls crumbled and melted, crashing down. Vast spires of smoke and spouting steams went billowing up, until they toppled like an overwhelming wave, and its wild crest curled and came foaming down upon the land. And then, at last, over the miles between there, came a rumble, rising to a deafening crash and roar. The earth shook, the plain heaved and cracked, and Erodruin reeled. Fire belched from its riven summit. The skies burst into thunder, seared with lightning. Down like lashing whips fell a torrent of black rain, and into the heart of the storm, with a cry that pierced all other sounds, tearing the clouds asunder, the Nazgul came, shooting like flaming bolts. As caught in the fiery ruin of hill and sky, they crackled, withered, and went out.
Well, this is the end, Sam Gamgee.
And there was Frodo, pale and worn, and yet himself again. And in his eyes there was peace now, neither strain of will, nor madness, nor any fear. His burden was taken away. There was the dear master of the sweet days, in the Shire.
Master!
Cried Sam, and fell upon his knees. In all that ruin of the world, for the moment he felt only joy. Great joy. The burden was gone. His master had been saved. He was himself again. He was free. And then Sam caught sight of the maimed and bleeding hand.
Oh, your poor hand,
He said,
and I have nothing to bind it with or comfort it. I would have spared him a whole hand of mine, rather. But he's gone now, beyond recall. Gone forever.
Yes, said Frodo.
But do you remember Gandalf's words? Even Gollum may have something yet to do. But for him's sake, I would have not destroyed the ring. The quest would have been in vain, even at the bitter end. So let us forgive him, for the quest is achieved. And now all is over. I'm glad you're here with me. Here at the end of all things.
All about the hills the hosts of Mordor raged. The captains of the west were foundering in a gathering sea. The sun gleamed red, and under the wings of the Nazgul the shadows of death fell dark upon the earth. Aragorn stood beneath his banner, silent and stern, as one lost in thought of things long past or far away, but his eyes gleamed like stars that shine the brighter as the night deepens. Upon the hilltop stood Gandalf, and he was white and cold, and no shadow fell on him. The onslaught of Mordor broke like a wave on the beleaguered hills, voices rolling like a tide amid the wreck and crash of arms. As if to his eyes some sudden vision had been given, Gandalf stirred. And he looked, and he turned, looking back north where the skies were pale and clear. Then he lifted up his hands, and cried in a loud voice, ringing above the din. And many voices answered, crying, The hosts of Mordor looked up and wondered what this sign might mean. There came Gwaihir, the Wind Lord, and Landroval, his brother, greatest of all eagles of the north, mightiest of the descendants of old Thorondor, who built his eyries in the inaccessible peaks of the encircling mountains, when Middle-earth was young. Behind them in long swift lines came all their vessels from the northern mountains, speeding on a gathering wind. Straight down upon the Nazgul they bore, stooping suddenly out of the high airs, and the rush of their wide wings as they passed over was like a gale. But the Nazgul turned and fled, and vanished into Mordor's shadows, hearing a sudden terrible call out of the dark tower. And even at that moment, all the hosts of Mordor trembled. Doubt clutched their hearts. Their laughter failed. Their hands shook and their limbs were loosed. The power that drove them on and filled them with hate and fury was wavering. Its will was removed from them. And now, looking in the eyes of their enemies, they saw a deadly light, and were afraid. Then all the captains of the West cried aloud, for their hearts were filled with a new hope in the midst of darkness. Out from the beleaguered hills, knights of Gondor, riders of Rohan, Dunedain of the north, close serried companies drove against their wavering forces, piercing the press with the thrust of bitter spears. But Gandalf tilted up his arm and called once more in a clear voice,
Stand, men of the west! Stand and wait! This is the hour of doom!
And even as he spoke, the earth rocked beneath their feet. Then, rising swiftly up, far above the towers of the Black Gate, a vast roaring darkness sprang into the sky, flickering with fire. The earth groaned and quaked. The towers of the Teeth swayed, tottered, and fell down. The mighty rampart crumbled. The Black Gate was hurled in ruin. And from far away, now dim, now growing, now mounting to the clouds, there came a drumming rumble, a roar, a long echoing roll of ruinous noise.
The realm of Sauron is ended!
said Gandalf.
The Ring-Bearer has fulfilled his quest!
And as the captains gazed south to the land of Mordor, it seemed to them that, black against the pall of cloud, there rose a huge shape of shadow, impenetrable, lightning-crowned, filling all the sky. Enormous it reared above the world, and stretched out towards them a vast threatening hand. Terrible, but impotent, for even as it leaned over them, a great wind took it, and it was all blown away, and passed. And then a hush fell. The captains bowed their heads, and when they looked up again, behold, their enemies were flying, and the power of Mordor was scattering like dust in the wind. As when death smites the swollen brooding thing that inhabits their crawling hill and holds them all in sway. Ants will wander witless and purposeless and then feebly die. So the creatures of Sauron, orc or troll, or beast spell enslaved, ran hither and thither mindless, and some slew themselves, or cast themselves in pits, or fled wailing back to hide in the holes and dark lightless places far from hope. But the men of Rhûn and Harad, Easterling and Southron, saw the ruin of their war and the great majesty and glory of the captains of the West. And those that were deepest and longest in evil servitude, hating the West and yet were men proud and bold, in their turn now gathered themselves for a last stand of desperate battle. But the most part fled eastward as they could, and some cast their weapons down and sued for mercy. Then Gandalf, leaving all such matters of battle and command to Aragorn and the other lords, stood upon the hilltop and called. And down to him came the great eagle Gwaihir, the Wind Lord, and stood before him.
Thrice you have borne me, Gwaihir, my friend,
said Gandalf.
thrice shall pay for all, if you are willing. You will not find me a burden much greater than when you bore me from Ziraxil, when my old life burned away.
I would bear you, answered Gwaihir, whither you will, even were you made of stone.
Then come, and let your brother go with us, and some other of your folk who is most swift, for we have need of speed greater than any wind, outmashing the waves of the Nazgûl.
The north wind blows, but we shall outfly it, said Gwaihir. And he lifted up Gandalf, and sped away south, and with him went Landrovar, and Meneldor young and swift. And they passed over Adun, and Gorgoroth, and saw all the land in ruin and tumult beneath them, and before them Mount Doom blazing, pouring out its fire.
I'm glad you're here with me,
said Frodo.
here at the end of all things.
Yes, I'm with you, Master.
Said Sam, laying Frodo's wounded hand gently on his breast.
And you're with me. And the journey's finished. But after coming all the way, I don't want to give up yet. It's not like me, somehow, if you understand.
Maybe not, Sam,
said Frodo.
but it's like things are in the world. Hopes fail, and then comes. We have only a little time to wait now. We are lost in ruin and downfall, and there is no escape.
Well, Master, we could at least go further from this dangerous place here. From this crack of doom, if that's its name. Now, couldn't we? Come, Mr. Frodo. Let's go down the path, at any rate.
Very well, Sam. If you wish to go, I'll come,
said Frodo. And they rose and went slowly down the winding road. And even as they passed towards the mountain's quaking feet, a great smoke and steam belched from the Samath Nahar, and the side of the cone was riven open, and a huge fiery vomit rolled in slow, thunderous cascade down the eastern mountainside. Frodo and Sam could go no further. Their last strength of mind and body was swiftly ebbing. They had reached a low ashen hill piled at the mountain's foot, but from it there was no more escape. It was an island now, not long to endure, amid the torment of Arod Ruin. All about it the earth gaped, and from deep rifts and pits smoke and fumes leapt up. Behind them, the mountain was convulsed. Great rents opened in its side. Slow rivers of fire came down the long slopes towards them. Soon they would be engulfed. A rain of hot ash was falling. They stood now, and Sam, still holding his master's hand, caressed it.
What a tale we've been in, Mr. Frodo, haven't we?
He said.
Do you think they'll say, now comes the story of Nine-Fingered Frodo and the Ring of Doom? And then everyone will hush, like we did, when in Rivendell they told us the tale of Beren One Hand and the Great Jewel. I wish I could hear. And I wonder how it will go on after our part.
But even while he spoke so, to keep fear away until the very last, his eyes still strayed north, north into the eye of the wind, to where the sky far off was clear, and the cold blast, rising into a gale, drove back the darkness and the ruin of the clouds. And so it was that Gwaihir saw them with his keen, far-seeing eyes, and down the wild wind he came, and daring the greatest peril of the skies, he circled in the air, two small dark figures, forlorn, hand in hand upon a little hill, while the world shook under them, and gasped, and rivers of fire drew near, and even as he espied them and came swooping down, he saw them fall, worn out, and choked within fumes and heat, or stricken down by despair at last, hiding their eyes from death. Side by side they lay, and down swept Gwaihir, and down came Landrovar, and Meneldor the Swift, and in a dream, not knowing what fate had befallen them, the wanderers were lifted up, and borne away out of the darkness and the fire. When Sam awoke, he found that he was lying on some soft bed, but over him gently swayed wide beechen boughs, and through their young leaves sunlight glimmered, green and gold. All the air was full of a sweet mingled scent. He remembered that smell, the fragrance of Ithilien.
Bless me.
He mused.
How long have I been asleep?
For the scent had borne him back to the day when he had lit his little fire under the sunny bank, and for the moment all else between was out of waking memory. He stretched and drew a deep breath.
Why? What a dream I've had,
he muttered.
I'm glad to wake.
He sat up, and then he saw that Frodo was lying beside him, and slept peacefully, one hand behind his head, and the other resting upon the coverlet. It was the right hand, and the third finger was missing. Full memory flooded back, and Sam cried aloud.
It wasn't a dream! Then where are we?
And then a voice spoke softly behind him.
In the land of Ithilien, and in the keeping of the king, and he awaits you.
With that, Gandalf stood before him, robed in white, his beard now gleaming like pure snow in the twinkling of the leafy sunlight.
Well, Master Samwise, how do you feel?
He said. But Sam lay back and stared with open mouth, and for a moment, between bewilderment and great joy, he could not answer. At last he gasped.
Gandalf? I thought you were dead. But then I thought I was dead myself. Is everything said going to come untrue? What's happened to the world?
A great shadow has departed,
said Gandalf. And then he laughed, and the sound was like music, or like water in a parched land. And as he listened, the thought came to Sam that he had not heard laughter, the pure sound of merriment for days upon days without count. It fell upon his ears like the echo of all joys he had ever known. But he himself burst into tears. Then, as a sweet rain will pass down the wind of spring, and the sun will shine out the clearer, his tears ceased, and his laughter welled up. And laughing, he sprang from his bed.
How do I feel?
He cried.
Well, I don't know how to say it. I feel... I feel...
He waved his arms in the air.
I feel like spring after winter, and sun on the leaves. I like trumpets and harps and all the songs I have ever heard.
He stopped, and then he turned towards his master.
Oh, how's Mr. Frodo?
He said.
Isn't it a shame about his poor hand? But I hope he's all right otherwise. He's had a cruel time.
Yes, I am all right otherwise.
Said Frodo, sitting up and laughing in his turn.
I fell asleep again waiting for you, Sam, you sleepyhead.
I was awake early this morning, and now it must be nearly noon.
Noon, said Sam, trying to calculate.
Noon of what day?
The 4th month of the new year,
said Gandalf.
or if you like, the 8th day of April in the Shire reckoning. But in Gondor, the new year will always now begin upon the 25th of March, when Sauron fell, and when you were brought out of the fire to the king. He has tended you, and now he awaits you. You shall eat and drink with him. When you are ready, I will lead you to him.
The king?
Said Sam.
What king, and who is he?
The king of Gondor and the lord of Western Land,
Said Gandalf.
and he has taken back all his ancient realm. He will ride soon to his crowning, but he waits for you.
What shall we wear?
Said Sam, for all he could see was the old and tattered clothes that he had journeyed in, lying folded on the ground beside their beds.
The clothes that you wore on your way to Mordor,
Said Gandalf.
even the orc rags that you wore in the Black Land, Frodo, shall be preserved. No silks and linens, nor any armor of heraldry could be more honorable. But later I will find some other clothes, perhaps.
Then he held out his hands to them, and they saw that one shone with light.
What have you got there?
Frodo cried.
Can it be?
Yes, I have brought your 2 treasures. They were found on Sam when you were rescued. The Lady Galadriel's gift, your glass, Frodo, and your box, Sam. You will be glad to have these safe again.
When they were washed and clad, and had eaten a light meal, the hobbits followed Gandalf. They stepped out of the beech grove in which they had lain, and passed on to a long green lawn, glowing in sunshine, bordered by stately dark-leaved trees, laden with scarlet blossom. Behind them they could hear the sound of falling water, and a stream ran down before them between flowering banks until it came to a greenwood at the lawn's foot, and passed then on, under an archway of trees, through which they saw the shimmer of water far away. As they came to the opening in the wood, they were surprised to see knights in bright mail, and tall guards in silver and black standing there, who greeted them with honor, and bowed before them. And then one blew a long trumpet, and they went on through the aisle of trees beside the singing stream. So they came to a wide green land, and beyond it was a broad river in the silver haze, out of which rose a long wooded isle, and many ships lay by its shores. But on the field where they now stood, a great host was drawn in, ranks and companies glittering in the sun. And as the hobbits approached, swords were unsheathed, and spears were shaken, and horns and trumpets sang, and men cried with many voices in many tongues, "Long live the halflings! Praise them with great praise! Cuyo I ferian ana, aglarni feriana! Praise them with great praise! Frodo and Samwise! Daura Berhael, Coninen anun, Eglerio! Praise them, Eglerio! Alaitate, laitate, andave laituvalmet! Praise them, Cormac Colindor, alaita tariena! Praise them, the ring bearers! Praise them with great praise!" And so, the red blood blushing in their faces, and their eyes shining with wonder, Frodo and Sam went forward, and saw that amidst the clamorous host were set 3 high seats built of green turves. Behind the seat upon the right floated, white on green, a great horse running free. Upon the left was a banner, silver upon blue, a ship, swan proud, faring on the sea. In the midst of all, a great standard was spread in the breeze, and there a white tree flowered upon a sable field beneath a shining crown, and 7 glittering stars. On the throne sat a mail-clad man. A great sword was laid across his knees, but he bore no helm. As they drew near, he rose, and then they knew him, changed as he was, so high and glad of face, kingly, lord of men, dark-haired with eyes of grey. Frodo ran to meet him, and Sam followed close behind.
Well, if this isn't the crown of all,
He said.
Strider, or I'm still asleep.
Yes, Sam, Strider, said Aragorn. It is a long way, is it not? From Bree, where you did not like the look of me? A long way for us all. But yours has been the darkest road. And then, to Sam's surprise and utter confusion, he bowed his knee before them. And taking them by the hand, Frodo upon his right and Sam upon his left, he led them to the throne, and setting them upon it, he turned to the men and captains who stood by and spoke, so that his voice rang over all the host, crying,
Praise them with great praise!
And when the glad shout had swelled up and died away again, to Sam's final and complete satisfaction and pure joy, a minstrel of Gondor stood forth, and knelt and begged leave to sing. And behold, he said, Lo, lords and knights and men of valour unashamed, kings and princes and fair people of Gondor, and riders of Rohan, and ye sons of Elrond, and Dunedain of the North, and elf and dwarf, and great hearts of the Shire, and all free folk of the West, now listen to my lay. For I will sing to you of Frodo and the 9 Fingers, and the Ring of Dooh. And when Sam heard that, he laughed aloud for sheer delight, and he stood up and cried,
Oh, great glory and splendor! And all my wishes have come true!
And then he wept. And all the host laughed and wept, and in the midst of their merriment and tears, the clear voice of the minstrel rose like silver and gold. And all men were hushed, and he sang to them, now in the elven tongue, now in the speech of the West, until their hearts, wounded with sweet words, overflowed, and their joy was like swords. And they passed in thought out to regions where pain and delight flow together, and tears are the very wine of blessedness. And at the last, as the sun fell from the noon and the shadows of the trees lengthened, he ended. Praise them with great praise, he said, and knelt. And then Aragorn stood up, and all the host arose, and they passed to pavilions made ready, to eat and drink and make merry while the day lasted.